March 5th, 1918. When we left New York, it was dark, and the skyline of lower Manhattan was twinkling like street lamps on a hill town. It was quite as beautiful as ever, but this time a whole lot more impressive. The Statue of Liberty, shining across the water like a column of fire, made every one of us want to stand at salute, and never before have I so fully appreciated what it stands for and how deeply it symbolizes our purpose in this war. I think we were all deeply moved by it, although none of us would confess it. We slipped away so quietly, lights out, and only the puffing of tugs to give any sign of activity. From the moment of my arrival on the ship, I was impressed with the fact this, for me, was the serious beginning of the big adventure. It might be undramatic at times, but it would never be anything but impressive. April 29th, 1918. I have just returned from our trip to the front. On the second afternoon of our arrival, Peixoto and I happened upon a funeral of an American soldier. It was my first sight of a military function of this sort, and I don't know when I have been more deeply impressed as I was that afternoon when we followed the slow-moving column, led by the regimental band playing a solemn funeral march through the winding streets, up the hill to the open country, and to a new graveyard overlooking the town. It seemed to me to be my first contact with the grimness and sorrow of war. And I must confess that after the 3 volleys had been fired over the grave and taps was sounded and echoed by another bugler posted off somewhere in the distance, the thing was almost too much for me. For our first day of work, we went as near to the trenches as we could get. The village we went to is right in back of the lines and forms the entrance. I made several drawings in this little place, all of them reflecting to some degree the results of German bombardment. But far more impressive to me was to see the men who had just that morning come out of the trenches and were now taking their rest and hunting billets, and the ever-present cootie. The village is so exposed to shell fire that it is not safe to occupy rooms above the ground level, and consequently the men live in cellars and dugouts like so many moles. You see them crawling out of these dark holes to sun themselves, and you see them sitting about in easy chairs taken from the remains of some demolished home, smoking and reading and acting quiet as if they were thousands of miles away from even the thought of war. And always they seemed to be cheerful. That was the one certain impression that I received of a good-natured, happily and expressively profane crowd of men, healthy and husky. I have the greatest admiration for them, and better yet, the greatest confidence in their ability to make good when the time comes. June 2nd, 1918. On the day that this third phase of the German offensive started, I had an opportunity to see what not many people have been permitted to see. That is, the city that will always stand as a monument to French bravery. It was perhaps the most impressive sight I have seen so far. The appalling desolation of the place is unbelievable. Except for the soldiers on the lower streets near the citadel, the city is empty of all human life. The houses that are standing are cracked and shattered, and the glassless windows, no longer reflecting the sky or surroundings, are nothing but black holes in the walls through which you look into silent, life-forsaken rooms. There was a death-like stillness everywhere. It was overpowering, the sort of thing that makes you want to talk in whispers. On our way to the upper part of the town, we passed great areas where the destruction from shell fire and bombs was complete. Nothing but piles of stones and timber where people once lived and loved and never thought of war. To me, it was a hideous sight. And in all this frightful desolation, I came quite suddenly at the turn of a street, upon a garden wall, from which fell a shower of pink roses, and their lovely fragrance reached out to us as if in supplication. It was the only beautiful living thing in sight. I reached up and picked a blossom, and as I did so, as if in protest, a shell went screaming over our heads. June 13th, 1918. Peixoto, Duncan, and Captain Adams and I took to the road in the general direction of the front. We had planned to have lunch at a town which is the big city of that sector, but we arrived earlier than we had expected, and so we decided to continue on a ways to where there is a large aviation camp. This is the same place where Lufbery and Norman Hall were stationed. Poor Lufbery, as you know, was killed only a few weeks ago. Preceding his death by a few days, Hall was forced to land behind German lines and is now a prisoner. And in this connection, we heard an amusing story. It seems that the Germans knew of Hall's popularity among his fellow flyers, and they decided to do the decent thing, and so one of them flew over the lines, and when above the aviation field, he dropped 3 notes telling of Hall's safety. But on his way back, this considerate Boche met by one of our planes, and in the fight that followed was forced to land unhurt and was taken prisoner. When the American aviator learned of the Germans' mission, he decided he would return the compliment, and so he flew over the German line and dropped a few notes announcing the capture and safety of the German letter carrier. Now, if this had been a magazine story, the American would in turn have been felled by an enemy plane so as to even matters, but as a matter of fact, the American messenger on his way back met with another Boche and brought him down. So the interchange of courtesies cost the Germans a good deal of trouble and 2 pilots and made the score of 2-0 in favor of the USA. And I suppose that after this, the Boche won't be so polite, and in turn they will point to the affair as an example of American ruthlessness. July 2nd, 1918. I am back again from a trip of 6 days, and this time we shifted our scene of action to another sector of the front that has brought the Marines into the limelight because of the fierceness with which they fought and cleared the Hun from a certain wooded sector. Before we left, we had been warned that we were undertaking a rather risky promenade, and were particularly instructed to duck at the sound of an oncoming shell and not waste time in doing it. To emphasize his instructions to us, the colonel told us that only a few nights before a captain and a lieutenant had taken this trail when they were stopped by a shell. The lieutenant ducked according to Hoyle, but the captain seemed to think it cowardly. The lieutenant came back with a slight flesh wound and told the story. But if the captain told the story, he did so in the hereafter. You can imagine that starting down a shell-torn trail over trees and branches that had been knocked over by the force of these explosions, and with these terrible stories still ringing in your ears, was the least bit nerve-wracking. Add to this the sound of the guns, the almost continuous whirring of shells overhead, the sight of the newly made shell holes in the field, and you have some idea of the conditions under which our men have to carry on. Our trail led along the edge of some woods and then into some open fields where we had to be especially careful not to be seen. The field path led to a sort of gully. This trench-like trail is the only comparatively safe day route to the woods. It is also well known to the Boche and explains the gaping shell holes all along the full length of it. It also explains the graves of 2 men that were hastily buried with their punctured helmets to mark their graves, and in one case a postcard that must have been taken from the boy's pocket, stuck through by a stick and planted at the head of the grave, in exactly the same way as one uses a seed envelope to mark the location of a row of flowers. All along this trail were scattered the leavings of discarded equipment, a couple of broken rifles, belts, a mess kit, a single shoe, food, and torn clothing, and at one point, where an advanced dressing station was located, there was a cluttering of these things that spoke so plainly of the desperate conditions that made the discarding of them necessary. In the mess of stuff was a letter which Peixoto pointed out to me. It lay there face up, and by stooping we could easily read it. It was a letter from the boy's mother in which she expressed her love and pride and faith in him and told of her prayers to God for his safety. Here it lay, discarded, in the trail of this clearinghouse of the wounded. It impressed me tremendously, and I have thought it one of the saddest and most dramatic incidents that I have come upon. August 8th, 1918. Back again after a week's absence. It was our idea to cover as far as possible the American activity in the Second Battle of the Marne. The first morning of our research we devoted to a general survey of the ground we would have to cover. We went up along the south bank of the Marne to a town which we then believed marked the limit of American participation. Like all these towns and villages, the place was a complete wreck. The main street cleared of debris for the passage of traffic, but the side streets and alleyways were nothing more than foot trails over piles of crumbled masonry and lumber. We stopped here long enough to make a couple of drawings, and then went back over the road we had come by, all along on both sides the graves of French and German soldiers marked by helmets or some other part of their useless equipment. And only too often we passed fields where horses still lay unburied, and what with these and the bodies of the men who had been overlooked by burial parties, you can imagine that the air was unbreathable. We continued down the road through one or two shattered villages and then crossed the river on a pontoon bridge which wore a sign, printed by our own men, "Made in Germany." As a matter of fact, it was made entirely of German materials, which in their speedy flight the Huns were forced to leave. By this time we were getting hungry, and so we crossed the river again and made for a village which promised to hold an officer's mess. The one we found was served in the comfortable dining room of what was probably the big house of the village. It was a rather hideous place, made even more so by the intrusion of shrapnel and bomb fragments, which had ripped through pictures, walls, and heavy panel doors. The windows, of course, were without glass, and as we sat at the table, the breeze that blew in across the shattered back garden was heavy with the awful smell of the battlefields. As usual, we were very kindly received, and a little later the colonel himself came in. The meal was progressing with the usual small war talk, when some question that Peixoto asked started a laugh around the table, an exchange of glances among the officers, a slight sense of embarrassment on our part, and then a flood of words from the colonel. He had not said very much before we realized that we had, by the greatest luck, struck the one man who could tell us why and how the German offensive failed. It was his regiment that had held and turned the Hun back across the Marne, and it was in this very sector that the heaviest fighting had taken place. My training permitted me to ask some questions of a tactical nature that were not so foolish, but that he answered them, and in doing so launched out one of the most remarkable first-hand accounts of a battle that I have ever heard. At the end of his explanation, the colonel asked us if we would have time to go over to the battlefield with him. You can imagine how we jumped at his proposal. A personally conducted tour over a fighting area, still fresh with the signs of battle, by the one man who was a stage manager of one of the most dramatic scraps of the war. So fresh were the signs of the fighting that we could trace the direction of the movements of the men by the direction in which the grass was trampled, and even more vividly by the position of the unburied German dead. Along the edge of the river, the caps of hand grenades and the fresh graves told a story of an entire platoon of our boys who held the Boche off until every one of them was killed. No one will know the individual story of their superb courage. It is enough to know that the Germans did not cross the river at the points where they had planned to, and that the only spot that they did succeed was where they passed over the bodies of a thin line of men who fought to the very end without yielding a foot of ground. And when the Huns did pass this point, they were met with a second line of American amateur soldiers who held fast because they were told to, and then by a third line, and when the fourth wave came, one of the best of the Kaiser's fighting regiments surrendered, that is, those who were left. The rest were out of it forever, and only 7 men were able to get back across the river. In the meantime, the fight was going on in another sector and progressing according to the German schedule until they looked back from a hilltop and saw the hitch in their movement. And so they turned their direction and began fighting downhill against this company. You see, these boys were getting it on both sides, coming and going. And by this time they were pretty well shot up, all except their courage. That was still working overtime. So they got together the better part of a platoon, orderlies, cooks, and some field clerks, and the remnants of another platoon, hardly 50 men and all. And facing almost in the opposite direction, they took shelter in a sort of gravel pit. When they were finally through with the job, the Germans had recrossed the river. That's the way our boys are fighting, and that is why we are today so full of hope for the future. The boys are just as good as they look. And let me tell you again, as I have said so many times, that they are a perfectly wonderful bunch, the finest soldiers in the world, barring none. The following day, we made a sort of review of some of the ground that we had passed through rather hastily 2 days before. I was particularly anxious to make a drawing of the crossroads of a village that had suffered heavily from shell fire and aerial bombs. We had passed through this place on the day the colonel took us sightseeing, and I recalled his amusing offer of a souvenir in the shape of a huge dud, which was lying at the side of the road. It was one of those tremendous cigar-shaped things with a proper tail, a sort of aerial torpedo. We thanked the colonel, but regretted that our collection of war relics would not permit such a weighty and dangerous addition. When we pulled up the short hill into the village, I was impressed by the absence of our men. Although always more or less on the move, it seemed to me impossible that they should all have cleared out so soon. So we stopped about 50 feet from where I was planning to work, but before our driver had time to shut off his motor, a French soldier came rushing madly at us from a nearby doorway. It was evident at the very first look at him that he was fairly frantic. He came at us, waving his arms, yelling, "Bomb! Bomb! Bomb!" Our driver turned the corner and ran for cover under a sort of woodshed. He stopped the motor and we piled out to find out the cause of all the excitement. There was a tremendous explosion, and as I looked over the rooftops in the direction of the crossroads, it seemed as if the whole village was being flung sky high. We stood there, all three of us looking at it like idiots, and the first thing we were conscious of was a mild shifting of dust, then a rain of dirt, and suddenly a clatter of big fragments of stone and shell. We had stepped out of the car without our helmets, and like perfect idiots, we were out into the open and gaping at a fireworks of dirt and stones. But not for long. Good Lord, how we did jump for an open doorway. After that, we asked questions about the whole affair and learned that the cute little blast was our old friend the Dud, being made safe for democracy, and that the reason the town was empty of soldiers was because the explosion was timed for 9:35, and it was just 9:33 when we drove up, not 30 feet alongside of it. Talk about your narrow squeaks. The next time the colonel of any regiment offers me a dud, I will make mighty sure to accept it on the spot, or be absent when it is presented to me the end of a fuse. October 28, 1918. The Spanish flu is busy all over Europe and England. This town has not escaped either, and almost everyone is more or less affected by it. Either that, or they are trying to dodge it and its full force. I left Duncan huddled before a fire this morning, complaining of a cold and a fevered sleep, and the rest of our artistic gang are either low in their minds or sniffling on the edge of a cold. For my part, I have so far managed to escape the epidemic. But here the misery of the sickness is made worse by the weather and lack of sunshine and the damp coldness. And so those who fall victims to it get mighty low in their minds, as you can imagine. And all the time the peace notes go back and forth, and we are kept wondering if there is to be an end to the whole mess before long, or whether all the overtures from the Boche are only a new form of the old and annual autumn peace move. I have given up trying to get at the bottom of it. First it looks to me like a complete German surrender, and the next minute I see in it only another trap and a continuation of the fight more bitter than ever. And then I learn of some friend that has been killed, and I am torn by two impulses, one to end it so as to save the rest of my friends, and the other to continue it so as to revenge those who have had to pay with their lives. I was particularly shocked to hear of the death of my old Delta U friend, Bill Baldwin. He was killed in action while leading his company against a nest of machine gunners in Chateau Thierry. Of my Plattsburgh company mates, I have learned of the death of one man, and I am very sure that there are several others that have been either killed or badly wounded. I suppose I shall never know the full toll until it is all over. November 11th, 1918. Well, it's over. Word reached us this morning from headquarters that the Germans had signed the Armistice about 8 last night. At 12 noon, France began to smile. It began with the town crier, who, as usual, went alone through the streets with his drum. But this time, when he played his drum roll prelude, he had the largest audience that he has been able to summon in 4 years. And after he had read the proclamation announcing the signing of the Armistice, there was a shout. Everywhere flags appeared, and the old gray little town turned itself into a flower garden of allied colors. The transformation was immediate. It was as if the town had broken out into a laugh. After lunch, we motored quite a way toward the front in order to return a lieutenant to his regiment. All along the road, we met the fast-spreading smile. It was dark when we got back, all except the town. After 6 months of black streets, the shop windows were ablaze with lights, lanterns, and even the street lamps burning. We could hardly believe our eyes. And by this time, the smile had been nursed with wine into a joyous and contented chuckle. The club, which had in the past shrouded its windows against the night hun, was sparkling like Saturday night at a country club. The real splash came after dinner, and it took place all over the club. It was assisted by 2 brass bands. After a while, one of them, having by that time suffered the first shock of champagne, was disorganized into separate raiding parties, with the bass drum leading one and the trombone another, and so on. By that time, all military rank had been leveled. A colonel was no better than the trombone player. In fact, he wasn't as good. He was allowed to buy champagne to keep the drum drumming or the cornet tooting, but in the chain gang parade, he was lucky if he got anywhere near the musical leader. There were no nationalities. The alliance was complete. It manifested itself in a change of headgear, Yanks with French caps and French with Yank caps. If you were lucky enough to get an Italian cap, you were a prominent and envied man, providing you could keep it. In short, it was a wild night. By the time I went home, I felt as if I had had about 16 of the Unc's famous Clover clubs. It was a wonderful night for a small town, like this, or for any town for that matter. January 19th, 1919. A whole month has passed since I have been in Paris. A month of comparative idleness. I am working, of course, but not with the same enthusiasm I did when the war was still wearing and we had to look forward to far-removed peace. Now the let's-go-home spirit has taken hold of most of us. It sticks into our subconsciousness and reacts against our moments of idleness in the form of extreme restlessness. Personally, I keep feeling that I am waiting for something or other to happen, and it was only the other day that I realized that that something was my ever-present and sincere desire to get back home and out of the army and take up the old life again. Face to face with the prospect of returning to our old occupations, so many men that I have talked with are waiting over here in a mood of hesitation, wishing for something to happen that will lift them clear of the old rut and set them moving into a new life and along fresh trails. It is surprising how general the feeling is. It shows how discontented the average man is with the work he has chosen or had to choose for a life job. In spite of the war and the nature of the work into which the men have been drawn over here, I think we have all come to a keener valuation of life and the way in which to live it. Perhaps it is because we appreciate more than we ever did before the brevity of existence and the consequent necessity of living it sanely and fully and simply and not burning it up at 90 miles an hour. It is a curious state of restlessness and uncertainty that we are in, and I can't but wonder how it will all come out.